Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today at noon East Coast instead of 4 p.m., our normal time. But we're super lucky to have Dmitri Alperovitch to discuss his fantastic book, World on the Brink. I feel like it needs like the dun 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 when you hear the title. I loved it as much as a book about a world on the brink one can love, but it's really smart. It does a really great job of bringing so many important, relevant trends together. And of most importance to me, it doesn't just leave you with a, start drinking and start prepping, but rather here are affirmative things that the nation and that nations around the world can do to ideally help this Cold War end without in the same way the last Cold War did without the violence. So thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Bruce. Really great to be with you.
So there's a ton to get into in the book, but your own background is so fascinating. And partly it reminds me of everything I love about America. I mean, you epitomize what's great. It's a family of really smart folks that decide this is a better place to live and to have opportunity that comes and fully embraces up to the point of now looking to give back, taking brains and entrepreneurial spirit in a place that allows people to decide they want to start a company in an industry that wasn't necessarily a thing. If you would please walk us from not quite being born, but growing up in the former Soviet Union to being on this Zoom today, the quick play version, I found it so fascinating. I think it's a pretty important predicate to how you see everything.
No, yeah, absolutely. So I was born in Moscow in the early 1980s and grew up, behind the curtain. And my dad was actually a nuclear physicist in Russia. He was helping to design nuclear power plants. And in 1986, this thing called Chernobyl happens, of course, and he gets very lucky. He does not get sent. A lot of his colleagues get sent. And in typical Soviet fashion, no one actually gets told what happened. They're just told, fly to Kiev, helicopter will pick you up and take you to Chernobyl, which is about 30 minutes away, and you'll figure things out on site. And as they land and they're walking towards the reactor building, the ground is black, and they start picking up the rocks, and they realize it's graphite from the reactor that had blown. And a lot of them got cancers after returning. But that actually was a seminal moment in my family's life, because after Chernobyl, there was an effort in Congress, US Congress, to work jointly together with the Soviet scientists on nuclear reactor safety issues and build simulators to train operators in nuclear power plants. And as part of that program, my dad was able to come here to the United States, actually to Maryland in 1990, and spend a year here working on this joint venture with American scientists. And after returning back to the Soviet Union, he said to my mom, who had always wanted to immigrate, but he was kind of always opposed. He said, what are we going to do in this new country? He didn't speak English well. And after returning, he said, you know what, America's not so bad. We should try to come here. So we eventually immigrated, and I ended up in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which I can tell you was a huge culture shock.
It's not the same as Moscow.
No, not at all. And ultimately went to Georgia Tech, focusing on cybersecurity and a lot of international relations as well, courses, and then went into the startup world and ultimately founded a company. There's now one of the largest cybersecurity companies in the world called CrowdStrike, about $80 billion market cap today, and retired from there after taking it public in 2020, and been focusing on giving back and philanthropy and starting Silverado Policy Accelerator, our think tank, that focuses on really ensuring that America remains competitive and the leading nation in the world in the century, and that the century remains an American century.
Awesome. Well done. Such a great story. And for those interested, the book goes into greater detail, which is terrific. So it's great that you were successful and you're giving back. And we see lots of folks like you who have been successful entrepreneurs. Often they go into disease cures, and you and Eric Schmidt are the only two I've seen to really dive into the question of public policy, particularly focused on national security. I'd love to understand both why you decided to found the Silverado, and then also the book. When did you decide I need to put down these thoughts into a book, as opposed to the policy work that the accelerator was doing?
Well, the policy was always a passion of mine. As I mentioned, in college at Georgia Tech, I was really focused on international affairs, even while getting a fairly technical degree. And then when I went into the cyber career, I found the two getting completely interlinked, particularly in the 2010s, when a lot of the activity that I was doing in the cyber domain was confronting nation states like China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea from trying to steal our intellectual property, interfering in our elections, destroying networks. So I've had the privilege to work on some of the largest hacking cases of the past decade, whether it was the hack of Sony Pictures by North Korea or the hack of the DNC by the Russians in 2016, and many others. And that enabled me to transition from just doing technical work to doing a lot of policy work. I was an advisor to the Department of Defense and worked closely with the intelligence community on many of these issues. And then when I retired from CrowdStrike, I really wanted to move policy forward in this town. Having lived in DC for a long time and done a lot of work with the government, I know that you know, a lot of people in the Silicon Valley have a very inaccurate representation of how to get things done in Washington. They tend to think that these big ideas that they have are the ones that really can transform the country and can get things done. And the reality is that it's very, very difficult in this town, as you know, Bruce, to get a huge idea moving. You may have, you know, once in a generation type of ability to do that, but you can make progress every single day that's small and incremental. But I'd rather make, you know, one step forward today than run a marathon in 10 years. And that's kind of our approach to things at Silverado and trying to get this country in the right position. But the book itself, actually, I started writing right after the start of the war in Ukraine. So at Silverado, our primary focus is China, what I believe is the main threat to America and American leadership in the world, America's status as a global superpower. But I felt a little bit like President Obama in 2021, 2022, trying to pivot to Asia and getting dragged back into other conflicts and particularly in Europe. And in late 2021, I was paying very close attention to what was happening on the borders of Ukraine, the mobilization of the Russian military. I've obviously, with my background in the Soviet Union, have always kept a close eye on Putin and what he was up to. And I became convinced that back in December that he was going to invade before the end of that winter. And I came out publicly with an articulation of why I thought that. Ultimately, that got a lot of coverage at the time, a lot of notice, and the war begins. And I get an email from this individual in the UK who was born in Ukraine, who had encountered my writings, became convinced by my arguments that the war was going to start, and convinced his family after much prodding and pressure to leave Ukraine literally a week before the war began. They lived in the eastern city of Kharkiv, and their neighborhood was essentially destroyed by Russian artillery. A lot of their neighbors perished, and he wrote me a really emotional letter thanking me for bringing this to his attention and pushing his family against their own thinking to leave the country and potentially saving their lives. And, you know, I've done a lot of good work over the course of my career in cybersecurity, but I don't think anything will come near that level of impact in my life. And the causes for that conflict in Ukraine, the reason why I became
dial back in and see if that
was going to invade Ukraine, I think are completely transferable to the Indo-Pacific. They're the same reasons driving Xi to invade Taiwan. Their history, destiny, security, geography, and ego, most importantly. And I wanted to write this book to raise the alarm bells about the potential future war, and that war, should it occur, is going to be much more disastrous for American national security, American lives, global economy, and we have to do whatever it takes to deter it. And unlike Ukraine, we still have time.
Great. So I want to get in my topics in my list. Start with Russia. Dive into China, ask a little bit about how you think our elections may be received abroad, and then get into some cyber stuff as well. By the way, one of our attendees, Robert Perkins, you seem to keep unmuting for some reason, and you seem to be on a phone call. Please either drop off or stay muted. Thank you. So what are the signals you saw on Russia? How come others didn't see it? It's in retrospect, it now seems obvious, but at the time you were the guy. You were the first guy to make the call.
Yeah, certainly one of the first, 3 months before the war began. And again, I've been a close watcher of Putin for his entire career since the 90s. And I feel I can, I understand him pretty well, having, the Russian background, being able to listen to him in the native language, I think has been a great help to me. I feel like I understand how he thinks. A lot of people in the West have this caricature view of Putin, that they think of him as just, an old KGB agent. And he's certainly that, but more importantly, he's a thug. And I believe that the transformative period for his life was not his career in the 1980s in the KGB, at the sort of decline of the Soviet power, where he was really a mid-rate bureaucrat focused on counterintelligence and not very successfully in the intelligence services. But his career as a deputy mayor of St. Petersburg in the 1990s. And the reason that's really important is that in the 1990s, St. Petersburg was known in common parlor in Russia as Bandit Petersburg. It was effectively run by organized crime. And as deputy mayor of St. Petersburg, Putin has responsibility for casino licenses, export licenses, business registrations. I mean, all of the things that would
No mobs there.
Right, it would put you into direct involvement with Russian organized crime. And I believe that's where he learned how to do corruption. That's where he got a taste for the good life and bribery. I don't just believe that. I know people that have dealt with him back in those days and have told me that they had to bring in a suitcase of cash to see him to solve problems. And his gangster persona, which he adopted from dealing with these people on a daily basis, really comes through every once in a while. He hides it fairly well under this bureaucratic persona, but every once in a while he lets it slip. And the first time it happened was when he had just become prime minister of Russia in 1999, and he launched a second war in Chechnya. And at a press conference, he said, we're going to kill them in the outhouse. Well, that's not a language of a government bureaucrat. That's not even a language of a KGB officer. That's a language of a thug. More recently, when he was just a couple of weeks away from launching his war in Ukraine, and he was having the shuttle diplomacy with Macron and others that were coming to visit him to try to deter this conflict. I remember there was this press conference with Macron where he quoted a gangster lyric that basically talked about a woman being raped, and basically the lyrics he was using in the context of Ukraine: whether you like it or not, my dear, you have to take it. Right. Again, that's not a language that you would typically hear from politicians or bureaucrats. That's the language of thugs. And the reason why that's important to understand Putin is that he feels like Ukraine is his. It's Russia's first and foremost, but of course he views himself as the new czar of Russia. So anything that's Russian, is his. And that was one of the key motivators for him to invade this country, is that he was looking at the flirtation that Ukraine was engaged in with the European Union, with NATO, with the West, with democracy. And he was like thinking, how dare you, right? You're mine, you're my girl, right? And I'm going to show you and everyone else that you belong to me, just like a thug, like a gangster would. As a typical gangster, he's also a coward. So he's not going to take on the big, powerful, competitor, NATO, but he's going to take it out on the woman, right? And beat her up. And that's exactly what he's doing with Ukraine now, is he's, in his mind, teaching her a lesson for this flirtation with someone else.
So
and
something else he's done that's certainly thuggish. People who are critics, particularly Russian-born critics, have been known to get poisoned and with radioactive stuff. Do you ever worry, as a Russian-born man who's a pretty prominent guy, calling him out for the thug that he is creates a risk to your personal safety? Or because you're a prominent American entrepreneur and citizen at this point, are you outside the reach?
Well, one would hope so. So I was sanctioned by Putin 2 years ago, which I was actually fairly pleased to see, because if you're on the sanctioned list, you're not probably on the other list, one would hope. So that gives me a little bit of hope.
Good. So to finish on the Russia-Ukraine, how do you think it ends? So you called it at the beginning. I mean, obviously, there's no doubt who's right and who's wrong and who's just, but it's fairly impossible to see, for me, a scenario that doesn't end with Russia ending with a larger bite than they had even after they took Crimea and the Donbass or otherwise. But how do you see the bloodshed ending, even if it's to a thaw?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So someone asked me this question about 6 months into the war, and I said, and I still hold that view, that this war likely ends in regime change. But there are three possibilities for regime change. A regime change in Moscow that brings in someone other than Putin that is not emotionally committed to this war and is would be much easier for them to end it. A regime change in Washington where you could have, a president and Congress in this country that just declines to support Ukraine and then they will lose. Or a regime change in Taiwan where China invades Taiwan, plug the book, and we are in an existential conflict with China, and our ability to do anything for Ukraine is going to be, going out the window, and they're going to lose as well. So I still hold that those are the more likely alternatives, unfortunately. And look, this war since about April of 2022, since Ukraine survived as a country, since they won the Battle of Kiev and pushed the Russians back away from the capital, had entered the attritional stage, where really both sides are now in this conflict over territory that neither of them really considers strategic at the end of the day, right? Putin, as much as he celebrates victories in places like Bakhmut or Avdiivka, these tiny villages that most Russians can't even find on a map, doesn't actually accomplish any of his goals of controlling the country. And similarly for Ukraine, the irony is that they're also fighting over territory, and they would certainly would like to take that territory back. But more importantly than the territory, they are fighting for their nation and for their durable security. And taking back, let's say, Bakhmut or Avdiivka doesn't actually accomplish that either. So you've got both sides that are in this World War I style attritional conflict without frontline really moving a whole lot and without their end goals being accomplished. And it's really a question of who wears each other out, whose will ultimately breaks. But it can go on for a long time. In some ways, this war has been going on for 10 years, since 2014, when, of course, he took Crimea and first invaded the Donbass. And now you have a second phase of that war, but it can unfortunately easily go on for another 10 years.
All right. Well, there's more to go there, but the as you teased out, the core of the book is that the entire world turns on the risks to Taiwan, both because of the Silicon Shield, the importance of the semiconductor industry going through Taiwan, because of the risk of the two superpowers in the world, or the two strongest powers, coming into contact with each other, the economic implications if things follow through. The book is organized, it's thoughtful, it explains how we got here, what the risks are, what alternatives, and we'll get into all those, but I'm gonna disorganize you a little bit. I want to start with the following question. If nothing changes in the U.S. policy is slowly but surely promoting a little bit more reliance, things like the CHIPS Act is promoting a level of de-risking and decoupling. So on the current trajectory, which is not stasis, but it's incremental, does China invade Russia? Does China invade Taiwan? When and how does it go?
Yeah, so the book is nonfiction, but it starts with a fictional prologue that's set in November of 2028, November 13, 2028, 6 a.m. And Taiwanese time, and it lays out how an invasion of Taiwan might unfold. I spent a lot of time in Taiwan and with U.S. military and Taiwanese military and others thinking through that scenario. A lot of people have this very simplistic view, I think, of how this invasion would happen, sort of having flashbacks to Normandy. It's about to be 80th anniversary of D-Day, so thinking that this would be sort of Chinese Day, Saving Private Ryan, Chinese edition. And that's just not the reality of the terrain. Taiwan is a natural fortress of an island. It's hellishly difficult to invade. I can't think of a worse place to try to invade. There's probably only a couple of ways to do that, and I think I describe in the book one of the few that could be successful. But I argue in the book that 2028 through 2032, that 4-year period, is probably going to be the most dangerous, hopefully the most dangerous, hopefully nothing else will be more dangerous, periods in the century. Because I think that that's when China is likely to invade Taiwan. Now, why that period? Well, first of all, they're not yet ready. They're still building up their military capabilities. They still have a lot of work to do to be able to pull this off. As you know, CIA has announced that they've gotten intelligence that Xi has given his military in order to be ready to invade by 2027. Now, that's not necessarily a deadline for invasion. I think that's a political goal more than anything else, because in 2027, of course, he's up for re-election in the Chinese Communist Party Congress in the fall of that year. So I'm sure he would like to go in front of Congress and his Congress and say, hey, we're now ready whenever we want to take this action. And 27, I think, the PLA, just because you gave them an order to be ready doesn't mean that they actually will be. So there'll be inevitable delays. And two, it's a terrible time to launch an invasion because you're very distracted with the preparation for the Congress, which is all consuming, making sure you lock up all of your loyalists' support. And you're also thinking of sort of the next 5-year program. And post that Congress that will take place either in late October or early November, based on historical dates, you're going to be sort of in this transitional period where you're going to putting new bureaucrats in various places, cementing the ideology and the goals for the next 5 years. And you get past all of that really in the second half of 2028, where your window basically opens. You've got a free hand. You've been reelected. You're no longer distracted. And at the same time, your adversaries are very distracted, because here's what else is going to happen in 2028. You've got the Taiwanese elections in January of that year, with a potential new inauguration, a new inauguration of the president in May. It could be the current one that gets reelected or someone else. But either way, you've got a national security establishment that's going to be in transition in Taiwan. You've got the Olympics in Los Angeles that are going to be fairly distracting for us. And of course, you've got the big election in November of that year, where, regardless of who wins in November this year, we know that that person is not going to be running in 2028 because obviously they'll be term limited. So you potentially have a new president coming into office or being elected in November, coming into office in January of 29. So the national security establishment also sort of on the way out, looking for jobs here in the United States. So we're distracted. Taiwan is distracted. China kind of has a free hand. So I think the window opens up. Doesn't mean it will happen then. But I think in Xi's mind, it might close in 2032, because in 2032, his term would end. And, theoretically, he could run again, but he's going to be 79. And that Chinese system, perhaps unlike ours, they don't tend to elect their leaders into the 1980s. The economy, of course, is not going well at all and is likely to continue getting worse. So he may have more and more competition inside the party for leadership. And beyond that, he's got to think about his own mortality. He's not exactly a slim guy. So who knows if he even lives that long, and what health state he'll be in. So because I believe he wants to do this on his own watch, he wants to get credit for it. It's not an accident that both Putin and Xi are in their 70s. They're thinking about their legacy. They're thinking about their place in Chinese or Russian history. And that time frame, 28 through 32, is a perfect time for him to do that, where he, if he's successful, he can get credit for it.
So if, one of the things about your book, it's you kind of took me from highs to lows. What you just mentioned a moment ago, that Taiwan's a natural fortress, and you explained all the reasons it's a really defensible rock and hard to invade. But you also talk a lot about they're doing all the wrong things. They're not making themselves a porcupine. They're not necessarily buying or procuring the right things. In a perfect world, everybody's going to school on the Ukrainian defense and realizing, if you don't need submarines if you're Taiwan, you need a massive drone fleet that can be sent out and sink all the ships if they send ships. It, I couldn't decide if you were ultimately confident that Taiwan will, by that time, recognizing the risk, in fact, be ready to repel an assault, or that nothing in the current trend line suggests they're going to get over their internal divisions and kind of a stodgy old military and the wrong parties focus on fighting the last war.
Well, look, you said the world on the brink. The title sounds ominous. I think the book is actually very optimistic because it argues that we have all the ingredients for victory, both us and our allies. The big question mark that I leave unanswered in the book, because it's really up to all of us to answer it, is do we have the political will to use those strengths to win this conflict? And we will see that over the coming years. And the same thing holds true of Taiwan. You're absolutely right. It is a natural fortress. It is so difficult to invade, by the way, that we ourselves, Americans, did not invade it in 1945 when the Japanese were entrenched on this island. We bypassed it to attack Okinawa because of the difficulty of taking Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time. Very, very challenging. The Taiwanese are making some changes, in fairness to them. They're reforming their training, their military training, extending it from 4 months to 1 year. They're starting to focus more on asymmetric defense. They're trying to procure more missiles, more drones. Not nearly fast enough, I would argue, but you're seeing some progress. But yeah, they're still enamored with these big, sexy weapons platforms. They're not going to do them a whole lot of good. When I was there at the invitation of the president last fall, she was very proud to announce Taiwan's first indigenously built submarine that cost them about $2 billion, which is not a small amount for Taiwanese defense budget. And she announced that she plans to build 7 more. Well, there are 2 problems with that submarine. One is that the Taiwan Strait is too shallow to put a submarine in. It's only about 300 feet. And when I pressed their chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who I met with, about how their concept of operation for that submarine is going to go, I got very murky answers about that submarine kind of hanging out on the eastern coast of Taiwan, combating Chinese aircraft carriers. And my response was, okay, they've got 2 aircraft carriers now, a 3rd one about to launch, dozens upon dozens of destroyers, numerous subs, and your one 1960s Dutch technology submarine is going to do what exactly? So you just basically took $2 billion and put lit it with a match, right? They're buying F-16s, which they need some F-16s to kind of combat Chinese invasions of their air defense zones and the like, but they're not going to be fighting an air war over Taiwan. The reason is that they only have a couple of dozen runways from which to launch these F-16s, and you can expect that the Chinese will crater them all with their rocket and missile forces, so none of these F-16s will be flying. Now, they're trying to do something, training, basically taking off these F-16s from highways, but that's more of a gimmick because, of course, you don't have fuel facilities, maintenance facilities on those highways. So, you can take off once, but, you won't have a place to land and maintain them. So it's not really going to help you. And they're buying M1 Abrams tanks, which, having spent time in Taiwan, I can tell you it's a mountainous terrain. Like, this is not Ukraine. You're not going to have tank battles there. So you've got generals in the military. They're enamored with these highly prestigious, sexy programs that are not going to do them a whole lot of good and cost a lot of money that could be better spent on trying to sink the Chinese fleet that's going to be coming across that strait with missiles, mines, coastal defense batteries, air defenses, and the like. And they're not nearly as focused on that.
We had Chris Brose on a year or 2 ago talking about his book, The Kill Chain. His point is what you just said, that is the mistake in the procurement and the strategy for Taiwan is also the challenge for the United States, that we love the exquisite platforms of the $14 billion Ford-class aircraft carriers, and yet the war, hypersonic missiles and all may make them have to fight too far out of reach. So you talked about President Xi's thinking. One thing, and by the way, it is absolutely an optimistic book. It's an ominous title. It's an optimistic book, which is great. It's kind of perfect because we want to read it because we're attracted to what's scary, and then you walk away feeling like we can do this. One thing I've always hoped might prevent the second Cold War from going kinetic in the same way the first Cold War didn't go kinetic, and the first Cold War was mad, mutually assured destruction. I always feel like the second Cold War, it's mutually assured depression. that if we go to war with China and China goes to war with us, both of our economies completely fall apart. And while obviously both we and China are trying to become more, less at risk of particularly Taiwanese semiconductors, but more sanction proof. It even if they develop more of an indigenous chip industry, and figure out their energy through Russia and food and such, if they face the sanctions that Russia faced, they're toast economically. So wouldn't President Xi on his way out say the upside of taking Taiwan is offset by the downside of global pariah depression?
Well, look, it's a great point. A lot of people make that point. I have two counter arguments to that. One, it's not clear to me at all that Xi cares a whole lot about economics. In fact, everything he's done in the last decade suggests that he prioritizes what he views as national security issues and legacy issues over economics. In fact, he's completely mismanaged the economy and doesn't seem to care a whole lot about that. But secondly, he may become convinced that either the sanctions will not be imposed upon him because of the importance of China to America and the rest of the world. And it's much harder to decouple from China than it is to decouple from Russia. And by the way, we're not even decoupled fully from Russia. They're still selling oil and gas, including, there was a story recently in the Wall Street Journal how they're selling it to India. India is refining it, and that gas ends up in American gas stations. So we ourselves are subsidizing Putin, right? So even on that one piece of our connection to Russia, which is fossil fuels, we're not able to disconnect. On China, we have numerous interdependencies, right? So he's going to be counting on that. And look, authoritarian leaders like that become very self-confident. I know someone who was close to some of the Putin entourage back 8 years ago when he was thinking about taking Crimea, and this person had since, of course, left Russia and so forth. But they were retelling me the story that the finance people around Putin, the central bank governor, head of the finance ministry, were telling Putin back in 2014, do not go after Crimea. There will be massive sanctions on us. This will ruin our economy. And Putin's response was, my job is to secure Russia's future, is to take Crimea. Your job is to make sure that all of these sanctions don't impact us. I'll do my job, you do yours. So I'm not at all convinced that she won't take the same approach to anyone that tries to convince him, to the extent that that would even happen, which is highly unlikely because he's, of course, centralized all power, put loyalists on the Politburo that would not say a thing to him that contradicts his thinking. But to the extent that they might, he would just tell them, do your job, I'll do mine.
Yeah, and I guess you also could look at whether it's Georgia or Crimea. There's also the sense that maybe the rest of the world doesn't want to have to maintain the level of sanctions if they don't feel directly threatened the way they do with the Ukraine invasion, but Europe may not with a Taiwan invasion.
And I can tell you, this is not a hypothetical. I spent a lot of time doing war games with US policymakers, Europeans, governments in the region. And I can tell you, this is exactly their thinking. And this is what China will count on, that for China to succeed, ideally it would have two things. It would, A, deter the United States from intervening on behalf of Taiwan, which if it manages to do that, Taiwan is toast because they don't have the capability today to defend themselves without us and our help. And two, to do it as quickly as possible, where you can accomplish this in a couple of weeks and basically present the whole world with a fait accompli. And then the rest of the world will be more than happy to continue trading with China and basically to say, like they did with Hong Kong, well, it's too bad they did this. They violated international law. They violated an agreement like they did with Hong Kong. But you know what? We got to keep trading. We got to keep supporting our economy, and we're moving on. That is what she's going to hope will happen.
Yeah, that's the scary stuff. So I'm not sure if you heard, Dmitri, but we have an election this year in the United States. And I'm glad that your 2028 scenario does not involve Trump versus Biden again, because that would be too much. But I'm interested in how you think China and Russia would adjust their strategy if the presidency goes back to Donald Trump. Obviously, it's a reasonable presumption that the strategy for a Biden 2.0 is the same as the strategy right now for Biden 1.0. So I don't think we need to get into that unless you see a reason they would radically change. But if Trump comes back, how do they adjust their thinking, their timetable, and their approaches, given he is more of an America first, less of an allies-based guy, seemingly more transactional? less kind of enamored of the NATO, the kind of, I don't know if it's romance, but Biden was always a very European-centric guy. How are those two adversaries looking at this election and the possibility of change?
Yeah, I find it much easier to predict what our adversaries would do, Putin and Xi, than to predict what we're going to do, because we're the ultimate irrational country that does things that make little sense sometimes. And Trump is the ultimate irrational politician, right? That you can't predict what he would do. I'm sure he can't himself predict what he would do in that scenario, and it can cut both ways. So, he's said in the past that he doesn't care about Taiwan and thinks that Taiwan really is a part of China, which is of course it's not. Maybe he would do some sort of trade where he would finally get his trade deal with China that is meaningful in exchange for Taiwan. But then also he does things like kill Soleimani, right? Where when the military leadership presented him with some options to retaliate for the killing of an American contractor in Baghdad, they gave him the option that they thought he should take, and then threw in this crazy option of like killing Soleimani that they thought he surely would not go for. And he's like, oh, I like that one, right? So you just never know. That's actually part of the challenge for China and maybe even for Russia with Trump, is that you've got that crazy uncle theory, crazy madman theory back from the Nixon days, that you just don't know. Maybe he will actually start a war, right? Maybe he will do something like kill Soleimani that no one expects, that may have a deterrent effect. So the short answer is it's unknowable. I think it's probably even unknowable to him, but it can certainly go either way easily. Yeah,
I was asked about a variety of countries, and I was actually chatting with, I'm sure Ian Bremmer, and it seems like obviously NATO would prefer President Biden to get reelected. One presumes Russia would prefer Donald Trump to come back. They seemed like they had a better relationship, maybe in Putin's mind. And my theory is that China is rooting for RFK Jr. Because that's the only possibility of maybe that guy is more isolationist or something.
The brain worm. By the way, I don't actually agree that Putin prefers Trump. He's made some statements that I think actually he believes that. He's very conspiratorial. He believes in the deep state. So I think he's become convinced, partly because of the first Trump term, that no matter who's in the White House, things will not change in the U.S.-China-Russia relationship. And of course, during the Trump presidency, despite all the nice talk between the two, the relationship only went in one direction, and that is south. And I think Putin appreciates that structurally there is not going to be improvement between U.S. and Russia, regardless of who's president.
Interesting. I've got 1,000 more questions, but as always, as the people who attend these know, I aim for about 45 minutes. That feels like the right amount to ask people's time. So you're one of the global cyber premier guys. You were among the first. You were among the best. You still are. So I got to go to some of the cyber stuff. The two cyber questions that I had are, first, the proverbial cyber Pearl Harbor, and the degree to which there is the risk. Obviously we've got extraordinary capabilities, but I assume so does China. The risk that a whole lot of stuff, if, before, God willing, before it would go nuclear, but a whole lot of stuff can get blocked or shut down or messed with. And the corollary of, I don't know if you read Pete Singer, who's a wonderful futurist. He's fun. I had him with a couple of his books on. The first book event I ever did was Ghost Fleet, which I still love. But the idea is, and you point out in your book, plenty of legacy semiconductor chips that go into military systems and hardware are manufactured in China. Part of Singer's premise is, what if they are Trojan horsed? Or even if you get more simply, like, there are millions of American homes with TP-Link home routers. They are made in China. They get updates sent over from the headquarters. Couldn't they be bricked? Like, if you were an enemy country, you don't need to cause everything, all the Roomba doesn't need to go kill me. But if you can make all the internet go down on the home front at the same time, that feels like an effective weapon. So how cyber vulnerable are we as a nation? And what are the things that policymakers ought to be doing in the short term to address it?
Well, we are very vulnerable, but not to the Pearl Harbor, but to the slow pinprick approach of death by 1,000 cuts. Look, the cyber Pearl Harbor analogy does not work. People have been talking about it for 30 years. There's not going to be a cyber Pearl Harbor. The systems we have are too diverse, too independent to be able to cause that type of systemic damage. And the problem fundamentally for a kinetic capability with cyber is it's short lasting. At the end of the day, you can always disconnect, unplug, rebuild, and start again. Like, this is not a nuclear weapon. It doesn't even come close. It's not even EW. And the fact that cyber plays a relatively small part of this conflict in Ukraine should tell you a lot about its real capabilities. Now, it also doesn't mean that it's pointless. It remains the best espionage tool ever invented, because you can break into these networks and collect information that's never transmitted, that's perhaps pre-decisional plans and the like. It's also a pretty good tool to delay things. So right now, the U.S. government talks a lot about the so-called Volt Typhoon threat actor group, which is affiliated with the Chinese military. And it's doing something very different from what China has traditionally done, which is break into networks, steal intellectual property, steal trade secrets, pass it on to domestic companies, or steal national security secrets. But what they're doing now is breaking into networks that have no trade secrets or IP value. They're breaking into regional water utilities or electric utilities or port operators. And the reason they're doing that is for pre-positioning, for potential disruption. And that's not going to take down our economy. It's not going to be Pearl Harbor. But what it may do is delay mobilization, delay the flow of forces and logistics to the region. Not by a lot, not by months, not by weeks, but maybe a couple of days, maybe a couple of hours even. But that could be enough to get a tactical advantage, right, in this fight. So that's really the fear of cyber. It's not the everything goes up in smoke. It's that it's gravity that is weighing us down, that is delaying our ability to act, and ultimately erode some of our capabilities.
Dmitri, you belong at the DoD or the NSC. As I was reading this, I was thinking, I wonder if he has any interest in serving. I mean, the book, which all the stuff that we haven't gotten into, and as always, I'll tell our attendees, we bought 100 copies. We're going to send out a link. The first 100 people to enter their mailing address are going to get the copy. Although I listened on Audible, which I always prefer to do. It's a great, I don't know who the reader is, but it's a great book, very well read. So it's fascinating. It was a great listen.
I spent a lot of time with a narrator, selecting the narrator.
He was great. Great pick. For hard copy types, the opportunity to get it is coming, and we didn't get into even a tenth of, what the U.S. needs to do. You've got 4-point strategies for everything, but would you be interested in and willing to serve in a governmental role in a like the old Andrew, what's his name, the strategy at DoD office, or NSC?
So I have and I do. I have been an advisor to the Department of Defense and to the intelligence community. I currently serve as an advisor to Secretary Mayorkas on the Homeland Security Advisory Council, and also on something called Cybersecurity Review Board, which was set up by the presidential executive order 2 years ago to be sort of the NTSB of cyber, investigating major cyber hacks with both private sector and federal government membership. So I don't think I'll ever run for office, although never say never, but that does not appeal to me in the slightest. But if asked to help out and I have the capability to do so, absolutely.
Well, we appreciate your giving us your time, even if it was only 45 minutes. The book is Whirl on the Brink. Dmitri, thank you for writing it. Thanks for being with us today, and good luck. From best I can tell, you're doing a brilliant job getting the word out. People love the book, and it seems like everybody wants to talk to you. So thanks for spending time with us.
Really enjoyed it, Bruce. Thanks for having me, and thanks so much for listening, everyone.
Awesome. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.